Hi everyone, my name is Blanche. I've come from Melbourne and I work at RMIT University with Lauren in the School of Global, Urban and Social Sciences. I wrote down notes, but I'm going to try not to talk to them, but I might get lost, so we'll see how we go. I wanted to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, whose country we meet on today, and also to acknowledge that I live, work and play on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, and also Dja Dja Wurrung and Boon Wurrung country in Victoria as well. So I'm going to be talking about, I guess, some work that stemmed from my PhD, but that I couldn't quite address within the PhD, in which this exciting event series has given me the opportunity to try to think through a bit more. So earlier this year I completed my PhD, which was really exciting for me. And although the PhD was motivated by climate justice and had that as a guiding ethical framework, about 3/4 of the way through my candidature I pressed Control F and searched for climate justice and took almost every instance of the term out of the thesis. So that was a really interesting moment for me of being sort of, what am I doing taking out what I thought was my motivation? But so the thesis aim had been to de-center humans from climate change pedagogy, which is, the sort of theories that we use to inform how we think about education or engagement and getting people active on the issue. And so that meant developing a relational or post-human account of ideas like knowledge, agency, what it was I meant by climate, what I meant by humans, and those sorts of things. And I felt like the thesis was at risk of becoming a really long glossary. And so I felt that the way that I understood climate justice at that time, and that the sort of commonplace understandings of how that term was operationalised, were sort of, or relied on a fairly Western, modern or humanist ontology underneath them. And I didn't feel I had scope in the thesis to develop a whole new way of thinking about climate justice that would align with what the rest of the thesis was trying to do. So I felt that I had to let go of some terms that weren't essential to completing the thesis, and so justice slipped out of the thesis. So this sort of, I felt that they were working at different ontologies, and this became kind of apparent at a conference where I spoke about my work trying to think of climate as an entanglement, and then there were a lot of legal scholars at that conference, and we sort of reached a bit of a stalemate in the discussion where one of the scholars was saying, but this wouldn't hold up in climate litigation. We need to have really tangible politics around who is vulnerable, who are the polluters, and those sorts of things. So this presentation is an effort to work towards developing some of the political implications of a relational climate ontology. I'd stress that it's a work in progress. I'm very open to feedback. I've tried to make some diagrams. Petra, yours has put me to shame, so please, please bear with me. So climate justice critiques dominant Western ontologies which believe that humans are fully separated from the non-human world, or at least that only humans can impact nature rather than nature affecting humans in turn. A climate justice approach attempts to counter this human-nature dualism by demonstrating that humans and nature are all connected. Yet in order to have an effective climate justice politics, the ontology of climate justice has to be recognisable and actionable within the system through which it is seeking injustice to be identified and rectified, which is often the Western liberal humanist one that generated climate change in the first place. And so this politics requires that the causes, processes and impacts of climate change can be identified and measured, and that the different parties have to be clearly delineated from each other and the connecting forces. Hence, in a climate justice ontology, a relatively coherent, distinct and unified group of humans create pollution. And because this pollution enters the atmosphere, it then leads to climate impacts, which impact a separate but also clearly delineable group of humans, sometimes other species. The thing is, to be connected actually implies separateness, which can be overcome to more or less of an extent by connection. And it always retains the possibility of disconnection. So climate justice, as I think we typically operationalise that term, offers an ontology that both resists and conforms to the dominant Western one, which it identifies to be problematic. So climate justice is trying to dismantle an ontology that Val Plumwood described as the mastery of nature. And Audre Lorde famously stated that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Of course, the challenge of working out how to tear down complex, resilient systems of oppression without in some way participating in them is as familiar as it is frustrating. So perhaps the master's tools might not dismantle the house, but they might be able to be repurposed and to chip away at the foundation slowly, while we develop alternative but complementary approaches which collectively might decompose it. And so perhaps we might understand the efforts to articulate distinct parties and measure impacts as a strategy aligned with what Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak called strategic essentialism. Strategic essentialism, I think I have another effort here at a diagram, involves the defining and promoting of key characteristics that unify a group of people when the homogeneous identity will be effective at bringing that group benefits. So we might see kind of stereotypes of particular groups of people, whether they're Indigenous or Pacific Islanders or whoever they are, being sort of reasserted in order to create that group boundary to identify who they are. There's risks of stereotypes and emphasising people's vulnerability within this. But the premise of strategic essentialism is not to deny the heterogeneity of those groups of people or to deny their interconnection with other people, but it's to not promote that, and it's to promote a unified, coherent group identity in order to achieve strategic goals. So perhaps the strategic essentialism of climate justice is one of the master's tools being appropriated and repurposed. And it may certainly offer strategic benefits for some groups some of the time. But strategic essentialism is largely a political move referring to the delineation of human identities. And what I'm concerned about is the ontology that enables such a politics in the first place, and which thus accounts not only for why particular human identity traits are claimed or hidden, but the whole worldview which considers entities rather than relationships as the constitutive building blocks of the world. So beyond or behind the strategic essentialism of climate justice then is what we might term a strategic atomism, or perhaps a strategic connectedness, an ontology that acknowledges that climate is deeply relational and that there is no clear or natural boundary between humans and climate, yet which concedes certain elements of that relational ontology in order to have political efficacy in a hegemonic system which requires and promotes sovereign selves as the subjects of justice. So while I believe this is politically valuable, I do think that the relationality suggested by climate justice needs to be further developed and articulated if we're going to move beyond, or if we're going to start to dismantle the master's house. So perhaps a relational ontology might not offer the sort of shorter term wins, but I think it's really important if we're to play the long game of really taking down the colonial capitalist system. So considerable development of more relational ontologies of environmental justice have been offered with the work of scholars and groups of people working on sort of toxic embodiment, looking at how chemicals accrue in people's bodies and breast milk and their unborn children and those sorts of things. Paradoxically though, despite the many more layers of relationality and complexity and connection that characterise climate change, climate justice efforts tend not to account for the same level of transcorporeality or viscous porosity or entanglement as some of those environmental justice works on chemicals have done so. Here's my next imagery. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in this regard, and I'm not sure what I'm offering can possibly address all the issues, but one way of reconceptualising climate ontologies towards a relational conceptualisation of climate justice, I'm going to talk about my approach of thinking about becoming with climate change. So this was a phrase I was using in my PhD to explore how to de-center humans from climate change pedagogy, not by ignoring them or by looking elsewhere, but by accounting for how what humans are always relationally composed and always in processes of changing because of those relationships that they're embedded in. So I think because of my concern with, or aspiration to get people involved in climate change and acting on climate change, I've really thought about this mainly in relation to people, but I think that some of the implications are generalizable beyond humans. So the idea begins with understanding of climate as a set of relationships and builds on the work of multi-species scholars such as Donna Haraway, who use the term becoming with, which emphasises how distinct entities, or what we think of as distinct entities, are in constant processes of shaping and exchanging matter and meanings with each other, and therefore are always becoming with each other. I use the term becoming with climate with in brackets or parentheses to identify that we're always becoming with climate as well as literally becoming climate. So unlike the multi-species approaches, which emphasise how humans and some other sort of species engage in exchanges with each other, but then still retain their identity as humans, but they've sort of changed which sorts of humans they are, and how the other species has also changed through that process but remains distinct. The approach of becoming with climate reflects, as Neymanis and Hamilton suggest, that the ebb and flow of meteorological life transits through us, just as the actions, matters, and meanings of our own bodies return to the climate in myriad ways. So that is, becoming with climate attends to how what it is to be human, or indeed to be any entity at all, is inextricably enmeshed with the ongoing dynamism of climate. We become with climate, but we also literally become climate. So thus, as climate changes, we're unavoidably becoming climate changed. Equally, climate changes because we change. This occurs in multiple ways, and we know lots about how the climate is changing, so I'll focus the rest of the presentation on how people are becoming with climate change. So for example, my PhD research explored how my undergraduate students' sense of themselves eroded throughout the semester of learning with climate change. So they went from being fairly entrepreneurial sustainability advocates who might have seen themselves as individuals capable of affecting change in the world for the better, so long as they knew enough, cared enough, tried hard enough. Spending a whole semester learning about climate change really decomposed that sense of individual agency, and for a lot of people, left them in this space of being really uncertain about what their role and their place and who they actually could be was. So my students' experiences of loss, grief, overwhelm, and the uncertain promise of hope speak to climate change's capacity to unsettle the settler, as it destabilises colonial capitalist imaginaries of the self as an entrepreneurial individual capable of taking autonomous action and having an entitlement to a bright future. As another example, I've been reading a little bit about this story that a group of journalists are documenting about teenage girls in Mozambique who are becoming what the journalists term brides of the sun. So due to changing climatic patterns, families who've lost parents in floods or who are experiencing food or water insecurity due to drought resort to selling their daughters as brides so that the family gets a short-term small amount of income, but also that the daughter is then in a new family who might be able to provide more security for them. So this means that they become wives and mothers as teenagers rather than going on to complete their education and live with their families at home. So for these girls, climate change, their bodies and their identity are deeply enmeshed. Climate change literally moves, infiltrates and reshapes them as they are relocated and become new wives and young mothers. Climate change embeds them in new relationships with both their husbands and their children. These novel relationships arise out of financial and ecological distress, but they also bring some financial security and perhaps also some ecological security as well. They close some futures for these girls, but they also open other ones. So for these girls, climate change is no longer an external set of atmospheric conditions, but a phenomenon that is lived in their daily interpersonal relationships. So that is the boundaries between what we call climate and what we consider to be the human I've lost my spot, sorry, moves or is reconfigured. Thank you. And of course, these new relationships contribute to climate in their own specific ways as well. Okay, so what might a relational climate ontology offer for climate justice? Could it contribute to a workable politics for actually affecting change in the world? That's probably a bigger question than what I'm able to answer in the presentation, but here are some considerations. A relational climate ontology provides an opportunity to consider relationships not simply as the means through which climate change connects entities, but also as the units or subjects of justice themselves. So rather than simply frame climate injustice as, for example, a lack of water security for a family, the loss of a mutually regenerative relationship between the family and the water system could be considered the injustice. And it may be the relationship that is considered to be the subject owing, who is owed justice. This brings an attention not just to the rearrangement of relationships and entities, but also to the qualities of the relationships. So we might consider whether a formerly reciprocally nourishing relationship has turned toxic, or whether a reliable relationship is now uncertain. Becoming with climate change emphasises that entities such as the self are composed through such relationships, and that entities are thus always porous, transcorporeal, or as Donna Haraway terms it, sympoietic. In a relational approach to climate justice, what might be considered unjust is not the rupture of a sovereign self, but the rupture of patterns of relationships, which in turn change how the self is constituted, and thus change what the self is or could be or could become. A relational climate justice might therefore consider what possibilities are opened and which are closed by climate change. Relational climate justice might be about maintaining possibilities for diverse webs of relations, which provide the conditions for ongoing diversification. The foreclosing of opportunities or overdetermining of futures might be considered unjust. Becoming with climate change does not preclude the articulation of boundaries, but it does critique the belief in essentialist divisions between groups of people, between humans and nature, or indeed any boundaries. As Nancy Tawana articulates, we can and often need to make distinctions, even distinctions between nature and culture. But they are made for a particular purpose and at a particular time. It is crucial not to see these distinctions as natural kinds or to read them as reflecting a dualism. So becoming with climate change does not dissolve boundaries, rather it brings an attention to which boundaries are created and how, for what purpose, and who benefits from them. Through an attention to the relational assemblages that are becoming composed, becoming with climate change offers a means to attend to who are we becoming, and is this just, fair, desirable, or beneficial? Finally, becoming with climate change therefore opportunities beyond that of a more liberal humanist approach to climate justice. But it also brings an attention to how such climate justice approaches operate. It can attend to how climate justice efforts themselves affect people's becoming. In this way, it adds an additional understanding to the idea of procedural justice, as meaning not just did people have the opportunity to participate fairly, but how did or might the process of participating in climate justice efforts affect the relationships that they are enrolled in, and thus who they are, and is this just? I've got a final example I'll speak through really quickly, which is around climate finance for adaptation in the Pacific. I have some of my students who volunteer with an NGO that seeks to help people in the Pacific write grants for climate finance funding. And I went to Fiji a few years ago and spoke to people about these sorts of things. So we have all these relationships that channel money and all kinds of institutions, ending up with the opportunity for people in Fiji to apply for funding, perhaps to build a seawall or something like that. But in order to write that grant application, they need high levels of numerical literacy. They need to be able to write budgets, develop project plans, and to be able to acquit grants and manage budgets. And it really pushes them into this neoliberal way of being. And so I think that bringing an attention to how even what we might see as sort of repaying this ecological debt, problematic as it may be in lots of ways, as something that enrolls people in new ways of being and identifying and new ways of relating to each other, can bring an additional lens to climate justice. So I think I'll leave it there. Anyway, thank you.